Kate Johnson says, I am Gen X. My older brother is a young boomer. I feel like his entire worldview came from Ayn Rand. We are polar opposites. How did she influence capitalism? Objectivism, what is it? Okay, so Ayn Rand was a Jewish woman who was living in Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution. Her father was a chemist, and she was quite wealthy. Jews didn't have it very good in Tsarist Russia. Generally, they were segregated, had their own villages, were persecuted. Not her family. Her father was a wealthy chemist, and they lived in a mansion. They lived pretty well. The Russian Revolution came along, and the country was in the middle of a war, and they forced her to, share her house with other people because it was military conditions. People were moving around. This is wars in which hundreds of thousands of people died. The Russian Civil War. The Bolsheviks, they forced her family to let other people live in their mansion because they were in the middle of a war. She felt very hurt because her father, who she looked up to, was humiliated by the military, right? They forced him at gunpoint, basically, to house these other people. And she was traumatized by that from childhood. And, I'm not saying that means the Bolsheviks were bad, but, any child, right? Seeing their father forced at gunpoint to do something he doesn't want to do. If you worshiped your father was this successful rich man, and you see him, being forced by the government to do something, to let people you don't know into your home or whatever, you can understand how that would be a traumatizing experience. You have to also understand hundreds of thousands of people died in the Russian Civil War, and it was a freezing winter, and there was food shortages, and that they were doing everything. It was called war communism, military communism. But she was very traumatized by seeing her father degraded that way, as a child. And so, she went to study film, and it was the Soviet government that gave her free college education. And she went, and the Soviet Union was making some of the best movies at the time. Sergei Eisenstein was one of the greatest filmmakers in the world. Even though the Soviet Union was poor and all of that, they made a movie called The Battleship Potemkin that was seen all over the world. And the Soviet Union was like a center of the film industry in the 1920s. And she got to study with some of the greatest filmmakers. And she studied cinematography, and she got a free college education from the Soviet government. And then she lied to get her visa, and she moved to the United States. And the understanding was that she was going to go to Hollywood and learn more about filmmaking and come back to the Soviet Union to make films. Well, she lied. She just fled the Soviet Union, and she lived in Chicago with her family. And her family noticed that she was not well. She was, and again, this is trauma. We'll do this to anybody. But when she got to Chicago, there was a guy, I believe his name was Hickman, was his name. What was his name? I think his name was Hickman. Yeah, William Hickman. There was a guy who in Chicago who found out that his wife had been cheating on him and strangled her to death, and he got the death penalty for it. In Chicago, and Ayn Rand fell in love with him, and she became a groupie for this wife murderer. She just was really turned on by the guy because he murdered his wife, and because he wouldn't apologize. They offered to give the guy life in prison and not give him the death penalty if he would apologize. And he said, no, I was right to kill my wife because that bitch cheated on me. And so the guy got hung and got the death penalty. And Ayn Rand got pictures of him from the newspaper and put them up. And she was sexually turned on and just had she was fixated on this wife strangler. So that's, not well. She wasn't well. She moved to Hollywood, because she wanted to work in movies, right? That was her thing. And when she was in Hollywood, she really hated the Communist Party because of, she was from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had traumatized her dad and all of that. So she hated the Communist Party, and communism was very popular in Hollywood at the time. And she was of Jewish descent. And so she became a Zionist. And she became a Nazi-aligned Zionist. Now, you don't hear a lot about this, right? You think, how could Nazis and Zionists work together? Well, look up Irgun. right? Look up the revisionist party. There was a faction among Zionists called Irgun who thought that the Nazis were good because they would make all the Jews have to move to Israel. And she became a fascist sympathizing, um, you know, fascist sympathizing, Zionist. She became an Irgun supporter. She says the first political cause she ever donated to was Zionism, huge supporter of Israel. And she hated the Communist Party. And she actually put up posters. She made her own poster urging people who were against Roosevelt to form some kind of movement. It was called To All Innocent Fifth Columnists. And she was sympathetic with fascism. And interestingly, in that poster that she wrote, To All Innocent Fifth Columnists, she actually condemned capitalism because she was a fascist, right? At the time, right-wing people weren't worshiping capitalism the way they do now. Back then, right-wing people said, well, we're against capitalism too, but we want national socialism. We want the Christian republic, the Christian commonwealth. It was common for fascists to oppose capitalism. So Ayn Rand, back in the day, when she was a Zionist fascist, she also opposed capitalism. World War II happened. After World War II, the Communist Party is being purged out of Hollywood. The House Un-American Activities Committee goes into full swing. She becomes a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And she testifies up and down against all the screenwriters. They're communists, they're traitors. She becomes kind of a celebrity. And she wrote a couple novels prior to World War II. They didn't get a lot of circulation. She wrote a novel called The Fountainhead, and it's about an architect who designs buildings in a very non-conforming way, and because of that, he gets impoverished and he doesn't get a job, and he eventually blows up the building. Then they build his building wrong, and it's about he's a heroic nonconformist, and it ends with him on trial, and he gives a speech and he says, once there was a man who made fire, and he was probably burned to death by his own invention. And it was about this non-conforming great individual who who was persecuted for being non-conforming. And the book has a particularly abhorrent scene in it, but it kind of fits Ayn Rand. The more you learn about her, there's a scene in the book where this architect who's, he has to work in a salt mine, because no one will take his buildings because they're so non-conforming and original or whatever. And so he was working in a salt mine, and there's a beautiful woman who lives near the salt mine. And she rides her horse by the salt mine, and the guy sees her or whatever. And then the guy breaks into her apartment and violently rapes the woman. And it's portrayed in Ayn Rand's narration as heroic and a good thing, right? It's rather disturbing. Ayn Rand had issues, but anyway, she wrote The Fountainhead, about this great non-conforming man, this heroic architect rapist, basically Howard Rourke. After World War II, she becomes very famous because she's testifying against communists before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And at the time, the American government was experimenting with different kinds of anti-communism, right? The standard anti-communism, the main anti-communism from McCarthyism was Catholic, right? It was the Catholic Church said communism is atheistic, it's against God, it's satanic, right? And that's what Joe McCarthy believed, and it was the Catholic trade union federations that were pushing the communists out of labor unions and stuff like that. That was the main thrust, right? But Ayn Rand was an atheist. She didn't believe in God. And she was, very useful to the House Un-American Activities Committee. And so they blew her up into something. They kind of made her famous, right? And she emerged, and she developed a system of thought that she called objectivism, where she basically argued that altruism is the greatest evil. Right? That when people care about other people, that's how evil exists, and that people should be purely self-interested and selfish, and they shouldn't care about other people. And she said that capitalism has never existed; it's an unknown ideal. She wrote a book that's over 1,000 pages long called Atlas Shrugged. And her writing style, it's interesting. It's very much, she tried to use the style of socialist realism Socialist realism, which was the Soviet state propaganda style. She tried to write socialist realism against socialism. And a lot of what she did, it's this whole thing that I talk about in a lot of my work. It's like, in response to communism, they come up with their own communism, right? So communists have dialectical materialism. And what is one of the principles or the ways of expressing dialectical materialism? It's A does not equal A, right? And that's in dialectics of nature. And it's that the first A can never be the same as the second A because the world is constantly changing. Well, Ayn Rand, her philosophy of objectivism, she said A always equals A, and that all that exists is reality, and blah, 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 right? Now, one thing that annoys me is that I have said on these streams, A does not equal A many times. And there are these fucking bread tube people who have no idea that Engels said that, and that's a Marxist phrase. And there's this, he just says that because Ayn Rand says A equals A. No, I don't. Engels said it first. And it's like people know the Ayn Rand shit and they don't know that Ayn Rand was parodying communism, right? A does not equal A came first. And then Ayn Rand came up with A equals A, which is her objectivist thing. And so, yeah, she wrote novels, she put on seminars, she was just this right-wing intellectual. But I guess right-wing isn't exactly right. She was a libertarian intellectual. She considered herself a conservative. She was anti-LGBT. She was pro-Israel. She was pro-regime change wars against communism. She supported the military draft. She wasn't exactly libertarian, but her philosophy was not, they rejected any form of collectivism, right? It was the individual above all else, which is not classically conservative. It's much more individualist. And she, I don't know. I mean, she was just a fixture of American politics in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. She died, and they push her really hard in business school, right? And that conservatives read it and think they're really smart, right? And it seems really smart. If you've never read Marxism, if you've never read philosophy, if you've never read any of that stuff, if all you've ever done is, watch action movies and the football game, when someone throws, Atlas Shrugged at you, or Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, or The Virtue of Selfishness, you're like, whoa, it's so profound. That's one thing, with all due respect to libertarians, one thing that drove me crazy about libertarians is, I'm actually interested in politics, and I read conservative stuff, I read communist stuff, I've done a huge amount of investigation, but these kind of like business school normie bros they have no idea that there's anything beyond that. And then they read one libertarian book. They take Econ 101 and they learn about supply and demand. And they're like, oh, I know everything there is to know. And they speak in this condescending way and they don't know shit. Right. And it's really, really annoying. And I mean, maybe this doesn't happen anymore. It happened when I was in college, right? Overnight, as soon as Obama took office, half the Republicans at my college suddenly were libertarians. They weren't Republicans anymore. I mean, they voted for Republicans. They took Republican positions on everything. They were libertarians. And they were all reading this shit. They were all reading Atlas Shrugged, right? And they would walk around like, oh, the market is, and they wouldn't know what they were talking about. They had never heard the term dialectical materialism. They didn't know any of this, but they just read, A does not A equals A, man, and oh wow, and capitalism has never been achieved before. We don't have capitalism; it's never existed before. And America is the richest country in the world because we have capitalism, but that's because we don't have real capitalism. I mean, it's just, and it's inconsistent. I don't know. And this is a general critique of anyone who starts pushing libertarian economics. It's dumb, right? First of all, America is the richest country in the world because it's capitalism. But if you point to any problems America has, well, we don't have real capitalism. We're actually socialist because we have a post office. Sometimes socialism is the post office in America. Sometimes socialism is Vietnam. China is a very wealthy country, so it's clearly because they're capitalists. Duh. Oh, China is brutally repressing people. It's because they're communists. And that's what communists do. I mean, they just play this game where bad equals communist, good equals capitalist, and our definition constantly moves around that's the only consistent thing. Capitalism equals good, communism and socialism equals whatever we think is bad. Obama's a communist, Obamacare is communist, Hitler is communist. I don't know how that works. Hitler is communist. Republicans are communist. Bush was a communist. And it's obnoxious. It's really, really obnoxious. But again, if you've never read politics, if you've never actually investigated politics beyond standard Fox News, cable news discourse, if you've never read ideology before, it sounds really profound. And so it's this thing that, these libertarian, these young, at least when I was in college, these young people that had never questioned anything, they supported the war in Iraq, they supported the torture. Suddenly they're free thinking now. They're libertarians, and oh my God, America is a communist country. And I will say my most frustrating thing about all of this was that the left had no answer to these people. I was saying, look, on my campus, all this stuff is really popular. We need to debunk this. No, we can't do that. No. We're just going to build the movement. If we build the movement, people will join the movement, right? And I wrote a pamphlet against Ayn Rand when I was in college, and they wouldn't let me distribute it. No, we don't need that. If we needed you writing stuff like that, you'd be in New York writing that stuff, Caleb. We just need to build the movement. We just need to build our anti-war rallies. And, these people will come to the anti-war rallies, and they'll see that the communists are leading the anti-war rallies, and they'll join us. No, we don't want to refute Ayn Rand. We don't want to have facts about the Soviet Union and stuff like that. No. Just build the movement. So it's really, I'm really mad at the communists, right? The communists had no response to any of this stuff. I mean, none. It was just build the movement, man, build the movement. So, all this stuff became very, very popular, and it is very popular, and it's very easy to debunk if you do the research, but that would require, knowing facts and reading books. And you saw the video of the PSL woman, right? That's racist. That's like white guy shit. We don't need facts. We just need our feelings, right? And we just need to be feeling that Trump is racist. That's the argument the communists should make. Trump is racist. I feel this way. Shut up, white man. And it's just, this is why the left sucks, right? The left is like the best friend these people ever had, honestly. I actually was angry to see Ayn Rand and all that shit being distributed, and I wanted to refute it, and the communists wouldn't let me because, all we have to do is build the movement. We just got to build the movement. Well, now we've got a movement, and it's on the wrong side in Ukraine. It's on the wrong side in Venezuela. It's on the wrong side against the FBI. Great work. Just build the movement, man. Just build the movement. So I don't know. I get frustrated because I take this seriously. I do. I really do take this seriously. I read Ayn Rand books when I was in college because I believed in communism and because this was a very anti-communist thing that was being very widely pushed. So I read it and I wanted to argue against it because I take this seriously, right? And now I have broken with the left and that we're out of the movement to the masses because I take this seriously. I take this seriously, right? And most of these people don't. They're just on autopilot. Build the movement, man. Build the movement, man. Well, Trump is Hitler. Everybody knows that, right? And I mean, Ayn Rand's a decent writer. And honestly, as I've gotten older, I understand Ayn Rand a bit more. I don't agree with it, but it points to the fact that there is an element of, there are some people that are very, very driven in this life, right? Myself being one of them. There's probably many people in the chat that are like this. We're very driven. We want to get shit done. We want to organize things. We want to write books. We want to, we want to start our own business. We want to do things. And most people aren't like that. Most people are not driven, but there are some of us that are very driven. And that the so-called normies, if you want to call them that, normies tend to resent that and bully people for being that way. That's basically what Ayn Rand's books are about, right? Howard Roark is a non-conforming, passionate architect who's bullied by the world, right? Atlas Shrugged is about all the innovators go on strike or whatever. But the problem is the richest people in our society are not innovators, right? Wall Street bankers, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and the DuPonts, they're not innovators, right? And that, she projects something that we all see in everyday life, which is people that are passionate and dedicated and creative getting ganged up on and bullied by normies. She takes that and says, well, that's what socialism is, and capitalism is when the creative individuals triumph. Well, that's not what capitalism actually is. But it's a smart projection because it makes sense. And the kind of person who would become a communist is the kind of creative, driven person who feels alienated from society. So Ayn Rand is a brilliant brainworm, to say the bullying that you've endured, the lack of support for your creativity and your originality, that's communism. Well, I would hate communism too if I thought that's what it was. But it's kind of a brilliant psyop in a way, but it's just incorrect, right? The billionaire bankers that run the world, the Western monopolies, are not creative, non-conforming, motor-minded individuals. They're not. And it's funny because this is just like George Orwell. George Orwell and 1984 is the same thing. It just doesn't focus on economics, right? Orwell focuses on thought control and social conformity. Ayn Rand focuses on economics, but it's the same thing. And that Ayn Rand, she reflects one version of what you call petty bourgeois fatalism, right? Petty bourgeois fatalism. Boy, there's a Marxist phrase that you can take to the bank, right? There's a highfalutin petty bourgeois fatalism. Well, after World War II, it became clear that the big monopolies and the communists were going to dominate the world. And so the petty bourgeoisie, the small business owners, said the future is bleak. There is no hope. And so dystopianism, 1984 by George Orwell, Ayn Rand's novel Anthem, it was we're going to lose our individuality and we are going to be crushed. We're going to lose our individuality at the hands of the working class or the hands of big capital, and they're both the same, and the beautiful individuality of the middle class will be crushed. Petty bourgeois fatalism. And it's actually a lot like the Trots, and it's interesting because this was some of the most brilliant political education I got, right? There was a friend of mine when I was in the Workers' World Party who was not a member of the Workers' World Party. He wanted to join, they wouldn't let him. And he had been in the Socialist Workers' Party. And he and I studied The Struggle for a Proletarian Party by James Cannon. And we studied the Shachtman split in the SWP that gave rise to the neocons, right? Irving Kristol and all these people were Shachtmanites. I mean, this is what this book is about. And I learned about petty bourgeois fatalism, and I learned to struggle against my own petty bourgeois fatalist tendencies. That I had grown up with that. Petty bourgeois fatalism has become kind of the ideology of the United States. You read 1984, it's required reading in school. You read Anthem, and that philosophical irrationalism and petty bourgeois fatalism, this belief in the individual above all else that Dugan calls out, he calls out liberalism, that's practically the state religion in America. And it was spoon-fed to me as a kid. My parents were small-town liberals, right? My parents both had master's degrees in college, but we lived in a really small town that was mainly very conservative people. And, we were the persecuted intellectuals, right? My dad really liked Inherit the Wind, the play about, the small town school teacher who's arrested for teaching evolution, and that, petty bourgeois fatalism, which is a really big part of post-World War II art and culture. Petty bourgeois fatalism is really pushed hard in the United States. If you go to college, you're going to get spoon-fed Nietzsche, you're going to get spoon-fed Leo Strauss, you're going to get spoon-fed petty bourgeois fatalism, right? And petty bourgeois fatalism, is toxic, right? And from my friend who was in the SWP, we studied The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. I'd already read In Defense of Marxism when I joined the Workers' World Party, and he and I had many conversations about philosophical irrationalism, petty bourgeois fatalism, and he taught me that, and I'm very grateful because a big part of my worldview, and eventually I discovered Dugan and his critique of Western liberal ideology, right? Liberal ideology, whether it comes from Ayn Rand or Leo Strauss or or Irving Kristol or George Orwell, liberal ideology celebrates the individual above all else and is fundamentally pessimistic. It views humanity as dangerous, as the enemy. humanity is the enemy, and the great people are the people who don't play by the rules and define reality for themselves. There is no truth. Truth is just defined by individuals. They can make their own truth. And the strongest individuals don't conform and just make their own truth. And Friedrich Nietzsche says colonialism is great because white people are not playing by the rules anymore. They're becoming brutal and savage, the blonde beast, and they're asserting their dominance. They're losing their Christian weakness or whatever. This stuff is really dangerous, right? Philosophical irrationalism, the ideology of Friedrich Nietzsche. Ayn Rand is basically Nietzsche for dummies, right? Nietzsche is much smarter than Ayn Rand, but Ayn Rand is Nietzsche for dumb business school jocks, basically. That's what it is. It's a watered down version of Nietzscheism. It's a watered down version of philosophical irrationalism. But fundamentally, it's anti-populism. Anti-populism. I believe that, yes, there are people like me, like you, that are motivated, smart, dedicated, want to change the world, and that we're not better than everybody else, and we're not persecuted by everyone else. We have a special gift. We have the ability to push forward history. And the masses are the real heroes, right? That's Mao Zedong. He says in the Little Red Book, the masses are the real heroes. And we ourselves are often childish and ignorant. We have a level of understanding. We understand the nature of reality in a way the masses don't. But at the end of the day, the masses are the makers of history. We're not better than the masses, right? We just understand that the masses, don't have the level of understanding. So with our motivation and our position, we have to organize and construct, and it's like a boulder rolling down the mountain. We want to nudge the boulder, but the masses are the boulder, right? And this is the role of the revolutionary, of the vanguard party, right? And the role of the revolutionary is not to be afraid of the masses and view the masses as the enemy. It's not to look down on the masses and want to rule over them. It's rather to understand the masses of people in their millions are the makers of history, but we have a special role to play in guiding them, right? We give voice to the sentiments of the era, right? And this is, if you read the heroism and the role of the heroic in history, this is if you read, there's a lot, right? Plekhanov. If you read Plekhanov's writings, if you read all this stuff, right? That the role of the revolutionary is you're not just like the masses of people, but you have a special role to play, and you're very important. But the masses are ultimately the real heroes, and that's an important thing to understand. I hope that was helpful to you, Kate.